Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Junior Economic Club of Canada Interviews. We are a federally registered nonprofit organization led by students committed to promoting learning and interest in the fields of economics, business, and finance. Among our various initiatives and activities, we seek to have interviews with expert industry professionals who are so kind enough to share their invaluable knowledge and experiences to us youthful aspiring economists. My name is Andrew Wu, National Director of the Junior Economists, and I will be your host for today's episode. Today, I have the great honor and pleasure to be joined by Andrew Grantham, Executive Director and Senior Economist at CIBC Capital Markets. Mr. Grantham has had experience covering the US, Canadian, UK, Eurozone, and wider global economy. Mr. Grantham, on behalf of JEC Canada, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We're extremely grateful to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me. This is a great thing you're doing here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I hope the audience is doing good as well. And speaking of the audience, let's perhaps give them a chance to get to know you a little bit better, just through an introductory question. Can you tell us what you enjoy most about the field of economics and what some of your responsibilities as a senior economist are?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been working as an economist now for probably more than 20 years, as you rightly said, starting out in the UK and covering Europe and the UK economies, moving over to Canada about 13 years ago. So what we do is we watch the economic data as it comes out. We write data notes about that economic data. We advise clients on what that data means for interest rates, exchange rates, etc. And then, as well as that, we do kind of deeper research into kind of trends that are happening in the economy at the moment, whether that be the labor market, productivity that a lot of people are being concerned about, tariffs, which are obviously a big concern at the moment. So that's kind of the day for us. It's the data notes, it's also doing that research and also talking to clients as well. And that's probably the part of the job that I find the most interesting is particularly in our role in economics, we get to talk to a wide range of clients, whether it be on the wealth management side, who are private investors, whether it be companies, and we get to talk to them, advise them about what's happening within the economy.
Great, very informative and good to know. As someone who's interested in pursuing economics myself, after post-secondary, it's good to hear what sort of I may be able to expect if I were to become an economist. So thank you for sharing that. Without further ado, then let's dive into some recent events in economics right now. And just as you've mentioned, tariffs is something that's on top of a lot of people's minds, I'm sure. So we can get started with that. Following reports that President Donald Trump will enact 25% across the board tariffs on Canadian imports on February 1st, as I'm sure most people have heard by now. How are you as an economist reacting to this news, and how do you think Canadians should interpret this news?
Well, first and foremost, as we're sitting here right now, and it might not be the case when people view this, but as we're sitting here right now, this is just a threat still. This isn't set in stone. And it is a threat that is tied to not necessarily trade issues that President Trump has concerns about, but is tied to issues at the border. And so if we can solve those, maybe we can get a trade deal that's better than the 25% tariffs that are threatened. So there is at the moment still a lot of uncertainty as to whether these tariffs will go ahead, whether they will be 25% or not, whether certain industries will get an exemption, such as the oil industry, such as the auto industry. And that unfortunately means that the only thing we know for sure is that there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment as to the economic impact. So, we've been crunching our numbers and depending on how big the tariffs are, if you get some exemptions, we could see a hit to the Canadian economy relative to our base case of somewhere between 2 and 5% of GDP. And as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. The one thing that we know for sure is that that uncertainty itself can be negative for the economy. We saw that during Trump's first term in office, where there was still a lot of uncertainty around trade, particularly in the first year before we renegotiated the trade deal that we have with the US and Mexico. And during that period of uncertainty, investment in Canada, particularly in the manufacturing sector, was very weak. So the only thing we know for sure right now is that the uncertainty over tariffs is in itself having a negative impact. We will know more about how any tariffs, if they do come, how big a negative that will be when we get some more information on just the size and any exemptions that are given.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm assuming this is something that's you're keeping an eye out quite extensively, and I'm sure a lot of Canadians as well are keeping an eye out for this on the news and just seeing what will exactly happen in the coming days. I believe Trump is actually speaking at the World Economic Forum right now, where I think he's emphasized again how he wants to bring, I guess, production back into America and has mentioned Canada in his tariff threats as well. But hopefully they don't come to pass and we do strike some sort of deal. I guess that's all we can hope for now.
And again, this is a moving target. So if we did this interview in a day's time or 2 days' time, we might be saying something different. But as of now, these are threats. There's nothing concrete yet. We know it's going to be bad for the economy. We just don't know how bad until we get some more details.
Yeah, for sure. That's good to know, and hopefully that acts as a little bit of a reinsurance to some people. And I just want to actually touch on a point that you had been talking about of how Canada's productivity and I guess economic growth is currently being impacted by these threats. But of course, this slowdown in growth and employment has happened since before these threats have come in for the past several years or so. I believe that productivity has been quite low. And this is actually an issue, or the weakness in the Canadian labor market, is more specifically, has been an issue that you talked about in this November, or in December, following Canada's unemployment rate data coming out for the month of November. Do the December labor market numbers change or alter your outlook on the Canadian labor market in any way?
Yeah, so the article that you referred to there that we wrote after the November numbers, we were just looking into the labor market figures in a little bit more detail than what you get at the headline, and just seeing why the unemployment rate was rising, what was causing that increase in the unemployment rate. And what we found out is that if you go back to last April, most of the increase in the unemployment rate came from what we would describe in economics as a supply issue, because we have very strong, or we had at that time, very strong population growth in Canada. And it was very difficult, almost impossible, to have such strong population growth and to be able to get all those people working in jobs at that same period of time. We just had a big surge in supply of labor. And really, that was the only reason up until April of last year that the unemployment rate had risen. Now, fast forward to November when we looked at that article that you referenced, and what we found was quite different. We found that, yes, a lot of the excess unemployment in the Canadian labor market was still being driven by newcomers into Canada, but we'd also seen some excess unemployment as well in other demographic areas. So even in people who had been born in Canada and who are aged between 25 and 54, which we call prime working age people, their unemployment rates had gone up as well, which suggested to us that what was once more of a supply issue, too much population growth, has actually been turning into a demand issue where you don't have enough demand for the labor that you have. Now, you mentioned the December number, which was released after we did that report. The December number was very, very strong. We had an increase in employment of around 90,000. We had a tick down in the unemployment rate. But when you look in the context of what's happened over the last 2 years, really that strength in December only really offset a small fraction of the weakening in the labor market that we'd seen up until then. The unemployment rate ticked down, but it's still a lot higher than it was a couple of years ago in 2022. So it was good news that we saw those employment figures. We don't think they would change the mind of the Bank of Canada in terms of them cutting interest rates further, because they will want to see more of this momentum before they convince themselves that they've done enough in terms of their interest rate cuts.
For
Mhm.
sure. And so this actually reminded me of what we've been previously discussing just with the tariffs. And so I actually now have a question of, do you think if some form of tariffs were to be implemented, of course, I believe it was either Premier Doug Ford or Justin Trudeau who had encouraged Canadians to buy Canadian more, following the potential of these tariffs to be implemented. And so do you think if some form of these tariffs were to be implemented, would that help strengthen or weaken the labor market?
So again, it depends on the size, it depends on the scale, it depends on the retaliation. All of these things we don't have final numbers on yet. But typically, what you would think is that a a tariff scenario, whether it be 10% or 25%, would lead to an unemployment rate that would be higher, worse than it would be under a no tariff scenario, because you would have a direct impact among the manufacturing industry, those people who export into the US, so they may lay off staff. But you'd also have some indirect impacts as well. If we retaliated and we get the tariffs, we would have a price increase in terms of our market here, and you get that increase in inflation, even if it's just a short-term one, then that could see people cutting back on their spending and therefore have employment consequences in other areas, not just manufacturing, but it could spill over to retail, hospitality, and those sorts of things as well. So it would be a negative in terms of the unemployment rate of tariff scenario. Again, we don't know just how negative it would be until we have some knowledge as to how big and to what areas are exactly going to be impacted by any tariffs that President Trump will put on Canadian exports.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And so you mentioned that the Canadian unemployment rate is actually at the highest it's been since 2022, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's the highest it's been since the pandemic,
Right.
since probably 2021.
Wow. Okay.
And yeah, and it's risen quite gradually. And people look historically, it's still not particularly high. Certainly not moving up quite as quickly as you would typically see in a recession. But it does suggest to us that we have the ability, again, that demand versus supply, whether it's a weakness of demand that's causing the unemployment rate to be high, or whether it's just the fact that we've had a lot of supply, a lot of people move into the country. We think it's quickly becoming a demand issue. So we can cut interest rates further, we can stimulate demand, we can try and find jobs for these people without having to worry too much about inflation. Again, as long as we don't have a tariff scenario that upsets all of that.
Now,
Okay.
so hopefully we do find a way to be able to address this weakness in demand to be able to, I guess, hopefully create more jobs through increased demand. And so this actually brings us to our final question of what is your outlook on the Canadian economy in 2025, sorry, in regards to any economic upturns, downturns, or risks that Canadians will potentially face going forward?
Well, risks, I think we've talked about that, the big one, which is tariffs and the impact that that could have on the Canadian economy. It's funny that before the US election and before that November tweet that President-elect at the time, Trump, sent threatening 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, we were actually quite positive on the outlook for the Canadian economy in 2025 and 2026, because what we saw at the time is that we do have signposts from the labor market, as we've discussed, the fact that inflation is back to the 2% target. We have signposts that the Bank of Canada should be able to get interest rates low enough to stimulate growth in the economy, to stimulate an acceleration, to stimulate more hiring without us having to worry too much about inflation. So we were of the opinion that as long as the Bank of Canada did the right thing, as long as the Bank of Canada lowered interest rates far enough, which we think is another 100 basis points or another 1% in their overnight rate compared to where we are today, then we could actually see fairly strong growth in particularly the second half of this year and into 2026. The big risk, obviously, is now around tariffs and will we get impacted by those tariffs? But the potential is there. for the Canadian economy to grow strongly. It's just a case of will global factors allow us to kind of unlock that potential?
It sounds good. So it seems that a lot of our economic future isn't necessarily in our hands then. And
Unfortunately not, no.
okay then. So I guess we'll just have to take it as things come, and hopefully everything will resolve itself and not be too difficult on the Canadian economy going into 2025. And we'll be able to see that strong growth, as you mentioned, in the latter half of this year. So that actually brings us to an end to our discussion today. Mr. Grantham, thank you again so much for your time and sharing with us all of your invaluable knowledge and insights on the latest events in the economy. I've really learned a lot about where our economy may potentially be headed and what risks to look out for, especially those tariffs. And I'm sure our audience has as well. Thank you to everybody who has been listening. And Mr. Grantham, thank you again. We've really appreciated having you on here and learning from your insights.
Thank you for having me.